Hey everybody, it's Robert coming to you with Sidestep Adventures. I'm out here with Mr. Dan AKIN again, and today we're going to take a look at a couple cemeteries. But before we do that, we're going to learn a little bit about some people that are buried in these cemeteries, and also how Dan knows what he knows about area history and the cemeteries around here.
First of all, I have a lot of people to ask me, how did you gain the knowledge that you have on local history? Well, I've always been interested in history. I think I got that interest from my parents. They taught me to be interested in things of the past, and I learned a lot growing up around my grandmothers. And growing up here in Waverly Hall, I was the only kid my age right here in town. And I really had no other people to play with, so I spent a lot of time with the older folks. I spent a lot of time in the neighborhood here, sitting on the front porch on Sunday afternoons with my parents and with the neighbors, and then in the town of Talbotton nearby where my grandmother lived. We would go over there and sit on the porch on Sunday afternoons, and I found myself just listening to stories of long ago. Well, my dad was in the plumbing business here in Waverly Hall, and I'm number 5 out of 6 kids. Well, my older brothers were his helpers, and as time progressed along, they went on and did their own thing, and I became his helper. And I started at around 5 or 6 years of age, going into houses around here with him doing work. And I found myself sitting oftentimes when he was under the house or under a kitchen cabinet or somewhere doing work. I would find myself sitting in the kitchen with the person that he was doing work for, and striking up conversation. And I found out at an early age that older people love to share their stories with someone who will listen. And I had a good ear. I didn't mind listening, and I enjoyed sharing stories with them. They would ask me, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" And I would talk to them about that, and then they would tell me about their lives. Well, I would start listening to things, and pretty soon I developed the ability to ask questions. Well, what was the drugstore like when you were a kid? And well, what did you do at the depot when the train came in? Did you go out and meet the train and see who got on and off and so forth? And they would tell me about train rides to Columbus and so forth. But going into all the houses around here, I developed ability to listen to people both black and white, and I was really fascinated with the black history. And I was even more fascinated that there were 1 or 2 people here in town that would really open up and share their history with me. And later on, there was even more people who would open up and share their history with me. But one of the first, and one of the people that I thought the most of, was a man named Arthur Horton. And everybody knew him as Bud. Well, Mr. Bud, as we called him, he lived on the outskirts of town, and he was a member of a very old family here. His mother had been raised on the Marshall Plantation. The Marshall Plantation was a big farm right outside of town in Talbot County here, and his mother had been raised there. And he was able to point onto the walls there in his house and show me the faces of all the people that he talked about and all the stories that he would tell me. He could point to each portrait on the wall. And I was really fascinated with that. Well, Mr. Bud passed away in 1980, let's see. He passed away in 1982 at 96 years of age. And he had a adopted daughter who came down and liquidated everything in his house. And I happened to go into an antique shop later here, and I found the pictures that were hanging on the wall there. And I knew every one of them because I remembered all the stories about them. Well, the antique dealer that had the pictures bought the frames. He didn't want the pictures. So he gave me the pictures out of the frames, and I brought the pictures up here to my shop, and they've been here ever since. But anyway, this right here is Mr. Bud Horton. And he was born in 1880, let's see. He was born in 1885. and died in 1982. That is his brother Julius. Julius was born in 1877 and died in 1924. This is their mother, and her name was Lily Marshall Copeland Mahone. She was born on the William Marshall Plantation just outside of Waverly Hall in 1844 or thereabouts, and she died in 1892. Well, she was the mother of 14 boys and 4 girls, according to Mr. Budd. She married Arch Horton, and Arch Horton had been a slave on the Horton Plantation in Harris County, and she had been a slave on the William Marshall place in Talbot County. Well, after emancipation, Mr. Arch Horton and she got married, and they moved to the back side of the Marshall Plantation, and they tenant farmed there for the Marshalls. And later I think they sharecropped with the Marshalls and also for the Willis family and for a couple of other families out there in that area. Well, when she died, she was buried in the cemetery that you've done a video on. I believe what we call it, the Mahone Family Cemetery, that's out on Weaver Road. I believe he told me that she was buried there along with his father, Arch Horton. And there is a marked grave there of one of the Hortons, which I believe may be one of his sisters. But anyway, this kind of puts a face with some of those unmarked graves that we are accustomed to seeing out in the woods, and where we just see a rock at the head and the foot. Well, in one of my conversations with Mr. Budd, one of the things that I learned about the cemeteries here is that we're out here on the front porch of the shop right in town where there's a lot of traffic, so you know it's kind of hard to hear. One of the things that I learned from Mr. Budd was the tradition of unmarked graves. In discussing the cemeteries around here with Mr. Budd, I asked him about his mother and his father's graves and whether or not they were marked. And he said, by marker, do you mean, do they have a name on the grave? And I said, yes. And he said, no, there's no name on their graves. He said, but, and you know, I asked, was that because of the cost of a marker at the time? And he said, well, markers were pretty expensive then. He said, but there were enough of us, we could have done it if we wanted to. He said, but in our family, he says, we go by the old beliefs. And I said, what is that? He said, well, the old way was when you die, when a family member dies, you leave your grief at the cemetery. He said, when we finished up at the cemetery and that grave was covered, he said, the men folks did the grave digging and covered the grave up. He said, when the men folks finished, you left the cemetery and you left your grief there and you never went back until there was another death and you had to go back and dig another grave or have another burial. But that was their beliefs. And their beliefs are, in other words, he said their beliefs came over with, he said back in slavery days, he said that belief was brought, as he said, from the old country. And he spoke of the old country a lot because he had stories that had been handed down. You know, these people, his family lived on the same farm in the same place for 100 years. And there were 4 or 5 generations that had lived there and had handed stories down to one another. And he recalled that his ancestors buried there in that cemetery brought with them a tradition of disguising a grave at the time of a burial, that they would actually cover it with pine straw and leaves, and he said they would try to disguise it as much as possible and just leave. And he said that was the end of any grief. He said you left it there. The picture over here on the far right is his wife's mother and daddy. Now Mr. Budd was married to Sarah Carter, and this is Sarah Carter's mother and daddy. Miss Sarah died in 1975, and her daddy was Robert Carter, and her mother was Sudie Mae Marshall Carter. Now Sudie Mae was also born into slavery. She was born around 1862 on the same Marshall plantation as Mr. Budd's mother was born. Her nickname was Suki, and I understand they had a lot of children also. They had They were married in 1876 and were the parents of Mose Carter, Fletcher Carter, Sarah Carter Horton, Della, Francis, William, Suki, Joe, AC, and John T. Carter. Those were their children. Well, these pictures hung in Mr. Bud's house, like I said, until his death. But Mr. Bud here, I learned a lot of local history from him. He loved to talk. And when he found out that I was really interested, with a genuine interest, he opened up to me, and I spent many cold, rainy days in his house, sitting by a heater, talking to him. And he imparted a lot of knowledge to me as far as local history goes. And one other thing about him, he was the local herbalist for the community. A lot of people went out there and he would mix different teas, root. He would go down on the creek and dig yellow root, and he had a trunk that he kept all these things in. And I do remember that the house that he lived in was trimmed in blue, and I think everyone knows that that's a tradition with some of the old black herbalists, that they would trim things in blue to let people know that there was an herb doctor that lived in a certain house. Well, his windows was trimmed in blue, or were trimmed in blue, and he had a trunk that he kept everything in, and that trunk was painted blue. And my mother owns the trunk to this day. It was purchased by my dad from his daughter when she liquidated the estate, and he was able to purchase a number of things from her, but the pictures were something that I was really proud to get, and were saved from the trash. And they were initially offered to a member of the family, but the member of the family they were offered to was a member of the Primitive Baptist Church, and that member of the family said that the Primitive Baptists did not believe in keeping photographs of the dead. So that's the reason that they were sold.
All right, so now we are in the woods, and we're specifically on the old Marshall Plantation, and even more specific than that, we are on the old Marshall Slave Cemetery. And as is often in a case like this, we're absolutely surrounded by graves. Most of them are just indentions in the ground. In fact, I'll turn the camera around in just a minute and we can see a row out here. And while there are a few post-emancipation burials out here, you said that most of these graves out here are strictly graves from slavery times, right?
Most of these are strictly antebellum days, pre-Civil War, before emancipation. Most of the Marshalls after emancipation are buried in a churchyard right over here called Bluff Springs, or they're buried at Salem Baptist Church, or they're buried over at the other cemetery, which is just a few miles through the woods here, known as the Mahone Willis Horton Cemetery, and there's some Marshalls buried there also. So this strictly began as a farm cemetery for the Marshall place. Mr. Marshall, the owner of this place, is buried in the Waverly Hall Cemetery, where the Methodist Church used to be in the old days, which was originally Mount Zion Methodist Church, where he was a member. And when this was the main highway out here between Columbus and what was then the capital of Georgia, Milledgeville, state capital, this was known as the Old Federal Road, and it's called the Old Alabama Road, and Mr. Marshall's house faced that road. And Henry Clay was one of the guests in his house and made a speech there. Henry Clay being a Whig politician prior to the war between the states. Mr. Marshall was a big-time Whig also, and Mr. Marshall was a state representative, and he represented Talbot County when the state of Georgia seceded from the Union. and he had to list his net worth, and I believe he had a net worth at the time of $144,000, which was a lot of money back in those days. And he had to list how many slaves he owned, and I believe that he owned 88 at the time that he signed up. So I also read once that I believe he was shown as not voting when it came time to vote whether or not to succeed, that he kind of took a neutral stance.
All right, so if we look down right here, you'll see a large indentation. And I know that these are always kind of hard to see on camera, but if you follow up, there's another one, and another one, and another one. And then over there, there's another one, and they are scattered all throughout these woods.
And this would have been one of the cemeteries that Mr. Bud Horton told me about, that they believed in leaving behind when after the burial. If you notice, I don't see too many rocks at the head and the foot of each grave. So that leads me to think that once that burial was done, no one came back here and marked these graves in any way. There may be some out here with a headstone at the foot and the head, but I don't see too many, do you?
No, I do not.
I see a lot of graves, though.
I do see a lot of graves.
Only by the indentions in the earth.
There's one here, and one there, and then there, and there, and there. And we are absolutely surrounded by graves out here. I have actually walked this cemetery before. I've never filmed it, and I was impressed with the amount of graves that were out here. It was a little bit easier to see last time I was out here because none of the growth had started, and this tree hadn't fallen last time I was out here either. But there are a lot of graves out here, and it goes pretty far back. So as we come back here, we do have more that have headstones on it. So this cemetery starts all the way, if you could see my Jeep at the road, it basically starts all the way over there. And then as we come through over here, it continues down to the end here. And we do have a few that have field stones as we get into this back portion of the cemetery. We've got 3 in a row right here. 2 more down there, and then all of these over here. Have a look at these, Dan. I thought this was pretty interesting that these all throughout there's no stones, but these at the back do have stones. And also look at the row right there. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And 6 and 7 and 8.
There are a lot of them.
And then over here, there's one right here, the field stone at the end, and one right beside it. Now, as far as I can tell, as we get over here, the graves kind of stop. That's the furthest one that I see over there. Then it's terraced off, and the ground is eroded right here. The row of field stones right here. And now we have the marked graves that are out here. I believe that there are 4 marked graves.
Like that says Josephine Marshall.
It does. Josephine Marshall, born, looks like 1949. It looks like born and died 1949. Born August 3rd, 1949, and died September 9th. Well, it definitely says 1904, so it's got to be 1949. That's by the People's Funeral Home in Columbus, Georgia. Again, fieldstone, big fieldstone and indention right there. And this says, in remembrance of, this is a scorpion, in remembrance of Mrs. Rosa Barber. And if there is a date on it, it is sank so far in the ground that I won't be able to read it. Maybe one right there. These 2 graves are pretty interesting here. This is Marshall Jr. He died August the 9th, 1917. Right beside him is his father, Marshall, who died February the 10th, 1915. It says at rest. And I'm guessing that Marshall Jr., since he only died 2 years after his father, probably didn't live very long. Of course, we don't have a birth date or an age, but I thought, you know, isn't that just an interesting name, Marshall? And again, father and son who died not too far apart from each other. And as far as I know, these 4 graves here are the only marked graves out here. When I walked around before, it was a little bit easier to see. Stuff wasn't getting green. But there are a lot of graves out here. This is a place, you know, if we figured, what did we figure, 200 in Samantha Street? Yeah. And this is a little bit bigger, I think, than the Whitehead Cemetery. So, yeah. You know, say at least 200 people out here, because they're all in perfect rows, and big cemetery, a lot of burials. Also, big old dead cedar trees out here. All right, Dan, so having walked the cemetery, up there we don't have much markings on the graves, not even field stones. Down here we have 4 marked graves and the field stones start to show up. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, the cemetery, I believe, would have began on the highest ground. That's where it would have started, and then as that filled up, it would have worked its way on down this direction. It couldn't go the other direction because there's a road out there. So it came this direction, and I think the newer burials took place on down the hill here. Higher ground being the more desirable spots. That's evidenced by the dates here on 1915 and the baby that's buried there in the 1940s, and that rock, that concrete marker over there is similar to the Terry graves up on the mountain, and that's what, 1950s maybe? That Ms. Barber? We can probably look her up and find what the dates were on that. Somehow through census records or something maybe, or maybe should be a death certificate filed on her somewhere. But what I would give to have had a camera and been able to come out here with Mr. Bud when he was alive, because he would have known more about this than anyone alive today, or anyone alive at the time of his 96th year. He spoke of this place very often. He spoke of this whole farm. He knew everything here. And he was the one who told me the story that I think everyone that lives around here has heard, that when the Union soldiers were coming through, Mr. William Marshall put all of his gold and silver into a container and brought it back here near this cemetery, between here and the house, not here, but between here and where the house was. And he buried all of his gold. Later, he went back to retrieve it and could never find it. He could never find the spot where he hid it. And to this day, they say it's still hidden. His own great-grandchildren told me that story, and they told me that it was true, that it was not just a rumor, it was not a legend, it was a fact that he buried a good bit of money back here when the Yankee soldiers were coming through, as they said. And the only thing that I can add to that is that when my daddy was growing up in Talbot County, he said there was a black man who used to come to the stores in Talbotton at Christmas time, and that every Christmas he brought a $20 gold piece to the stores. And this was in the 1930s, on up until late 1930s, early 30s to late 30s, when people were really having a hard time making a living then. And he would bring one gold piece in, and he would do his, pay off his bills, buy for his family and anyone else who was in need of it at his church. And he paid for it with a pre-Civil War gold piece. And of course, the merchants would always say, "Where did you get this?" And he would always tell them the same story, that he had a dream and that he was told in the dream where to go get this money when he needed it. And he was told to only get what he needed and not get a penny more, and that each time he needed it, it would be there for him the next time, as long as he did not ever divulge the location. So he went there after having this dream, and he found the money. And he did exactly what the dream told him. He took one piece, paid his bills, and he was, I guess he had self-restraint enough to never go back except once a year when he needed it. And needless to say, a lot of people followed that man everywhere he went. Because around Christmas time, they would always want to know where he was and what part of the county he was in, but no one ever knew until he arrived at the store with his gold piece.